You've got the mix loaded up into your DAW. You've got an idea of how you want the final mix to sound. You may even have an idea of what steps you need to take to get there, but you just can't seem to get started. Or perhaps you've gotten started, but it just seems to be taking forever to get any kind of results. It's overwhelming and it's frustrating. And I know how it feels because this is exactly how I felt when I first started mixing. I wanted to hear some clear results early on in the mixing process to show that I was on the right track. And when this didn't happen, I found it hard to stay motivated and focused. But it doesn't have to be this way. In this video, I'm going to go through my 6-step mixing process that you can use to get started on your mixes and get results fast. Hey everyone, Joe here. One of the most common issues that new mixers find when they start mixing music is simply getting started. And this may be the case for you too. If you look at all those tracks in your DAW and think, which one do I start mixing first? Do I have to pick one or do I mix them all together? What should my DAW look like? Where should my buses go? All these questions going around in your head before you can even start making things sound the way they should. And then maybe you get started and start focusing on a particular track, and you've spent a couple of hours getting the vocals just right, or the kick and snare, but then listening to the mix as a whole, it really doesn't sound much closer to that final mix. This doesn't have to be the case though. According to the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, just 20% of our efforts on a particular task are the cause of 80% of the results. Let's apply this to mixing. Say for example, a full song mix takes 8 hours to complete. In around just 2 hours of that, we should be able to get to around the 80% mark towards your finished mix. Reaching that stage in just an hour or two is really motivating, and it gives us a much more clear picture on what the full mix is supposed to sound like. However, this can only be achieved by following an efficient process. Now I'm going to show you my process on how I mix my music. This is the process that I've been following for years, and it's been really effective on getting started fast and getting results. And at the end of this video, I'm going to share with you something super useful, a guide that you can download that goes through all the mixing steps and also gives you some tutorials, some links to some useful information that will give you the knowledge that you need to action each of these steps. Step 1, setup and prep. Setting up the session correctly in your DAW is key to speeding up your process, getting your head in the right place, and it helps you to not get overwhelmed when you've got everything organized and everything set up the way it needs to be. You don't want to be messing around with DAW settings if you can avoid it in the middle of a mix, having to mess around with groups and buses and not being able to find certain instruments and tracks. So if we get that all sorted beforehand, it'll make the mixing process much smoother. So before you do any actual mixing, these are the actions that I recommend that you take first. Make sure all of the audio is edited, so get rid of any clicks, breaths, pops, things like that. If something's been recorded really quietly, if your DAW allows for it, you can bring up the clip gain of that particular piece of audio to get it in line with the rest of the tracks, or bring it down if it's been recorded a little bit too hot. Just aim to get all the audio sounding as good as it can be before starting the mix. Also, get all the tracks ordered in a way that's logical to you. So personally, I like to have all the drums at the bottom, and then I'll set up a drum bus for all the drums to go into just above it. And then I've got the guitars and the vocals right at the top. And then again, my buses where the audio is routed through. I'll have them right next to the relevant tracks, so I can easily make changes to all of the tracks. And then I've got all my non-bus tracks and the buses themselves routed into a mix bus, so I can make changes to the mix as a whole. But again, any way that is logical to you is how you should set up your mix. Don't worry about looking at sort of pro mixes and thinking, oh, they've got their drums at the top and they've got all their buses at the bottom. If it's comfortable to you, then that's how you should proceed. Also, get things color coded. Personally, my mixes look pretty colorful. It looks like a rainbow. Not everyone likes to do that, but at least if you can get all your sort of MIDI instruments the same color and maybe all your drums the same color, it really helps you at a glance when you're just scrolling down, especially if you've got a lot of tracks, just to find what you're looking for. You should also name your tracks to something that's easy to read. If someone sent you, say, 10 backing vocals to mix, for example, maybe they're split into 5 different parts with 2 harmonies on each. Maybe name those harmony 1, harmony 2, harmony 3, for example, rather than just backing vocal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It just makes it a lot clearer. And then you can also set up individual groups for each of those harmonies. Again, it just makes it easier to see what you're looking for at a glance and stops you from having to think, oh, what's this one there? And having to play the audio and so on. You can just get it labeled early on. So you know what you're dealing with. And also track markers, where you place markers. Pretty much all DAWs can do this for your verses, choruses and so on, again, so that you can see at a glance where if you need to go back to a chorus and only work on that, you can quickly scroll left and right and find it. And get some effects buses set up as well. So at the bottom of my mixes I've got 4 or 5 buses with different kinds of reverb and delays, just so you can quickly activate them on a track when needed, and then maybe make some adjustments depending on what your mix needs. But then the number one thing to do when you've done all this is save it as a template if you haven't done so already, because presumably you're going to be doing a lot more mixes, and having that template there with all the buses and stuff already set up, that will really speed up your process next time. Step 2, balancing levels. Now you're ready to mix. Getting all of the levels balanced probably has the highest progress to time ratio out of all the things you can do with mixing. You can really make a huge amount of progress simply by getting the levels balanced so you can hear everything at the level that it's meant to be heard. Now this should only take maybe 15 to 20 minutes depending on how many tracks you have in your mix, but basically what you want to do is you want to highlight a certain region or even the whole song, put it on a loop, and then as it goes through, you want to start bringing faders down on instruments that are too loud mainly. So say you're listening through and the vocals are just overpowering everything. Rather than bringing everything else up, bring the vocals down. Now what this does is stop the overall level of the mix from getting too loud and start clipping in our DAW. Of course some things are going to be a little bit too quiet and you might have to make some adjustments, but overall I'd focus on bringing the stuff that's too loud down. And you'll know the levels are balanced once you can hear each track how it should be in relation to the other tracks, where nothing's too overpowering and nothing's getting lost too much. And after that you should have a solid starting point and a bit more clarity on which tracks need a little more something to stand out. And ultimately already by this stage it's going to be sounding a lot more pleasant to the listener. And this is what I was saying about the 80-20 rule at the beginning. Even though you've only spent maybe an hour at this stage, you've probably gotten at least halfway towards a really great sounding mix just by getting those levels balanced so you can hear everything right. And step 3 is the micro mixing stage. This is where you go through each individual track soloed and give them all a basic mix. Now what this does is gives you a little bit of time with each individual track, getting to know exactly what they sound like, and doing basic things like filtering out the low end on tracks that don't need it, doing some basic compression and things like that. Normally I start off with the drums and the bass, but again this is more personal preference, and depending on the song your decision on which track you start with first might change. So for example, if the vocals are really important in a certain song, you might want to start with those and then build the rest of the mix around the vocals. But generally I find that the drums and bass are a good starting point, especially with rock music, which is what I spend a lot of my mixing time on. So I'd normally start with some subtractive EQ, removing anything that I don't think needs to be there. And then I'll put compression on, and then I'll apply some additive EQ if needs be. But even though we're mixing from a micro mixing perspective with most things soloed, I always go back and check how they sound with the rest of the track. I'll constantly go back and forth, especially when I'm mixing things like kick drum and bass, things that take up a similar space in the frequency spectrum. I'll definitely be listening those together as well as soloed. At this point, if things are sounding nice and clear together, I'll start panning. So I don't pan right at the beginning. This means that I can make sure things stand out on their own, not just because they're panned at opposite sides of the stereo field, which is especially useful for getting your mixes to sound great in mono as well. And step 4 is macro mixing. This is where I spend most of the time listening to the mix as a whole. Now by this point in the mix, you've probably hit that 80% mark where things are really starting to take shape. But we want to start making some more subtle tweaks now, thinking about how each track interacts with each other, adding little extra effects and just generally breathing more life into the mix. So here you'll want to listen through the mix, mainly avoiding the solo buttons. You're particularly going to be focusing on the problematic parts of the mix that don't quite sound right yet. I recommend making use of contrasting EQ. You might be adding harmonic excitement at this stage. You might want to do some rebalancing of the levels now if you feel that things have changed since we first balanced them at the beginning. You can make use of sidechain compression at this stage as well. For example, getting your kick to activate a compressor that's on your bass track, just to get things gelling better and getting things more balanced. Also, you may feel at this stage that the mix as a whole needs something. For example, a little bit of overall compression, and that's where the mix bus comes in. So you can make changes to the mix bus at this stage to affect the whole mix. And step 5 is automation. Automation lets you change how a plugin affects the audio at different points in the track. So in your DAW, you should be able to set automation points to change settings in a plugin or bring up and down levels of a track. For example, you can increase the levels of delays and reverbs in more sparse sections of the mix, or you can widen out the stereo field only in the choruses to make them really pop. There are millions of ways that you can use automation. Those are just a couple of examples. It really depends on what's right for your mix. Again, I'm going to share with you something that you can download for free at the end of this video that goes really a lot more in depth into the different parts of the process. And step 6 is the final touches. At this point, your mix should be more or less where you want it to be, with just a few subtle tweaks and changes to get it ready for mastering. So play the full song through, focusing mainly on any parts that you don't feel sound quite right yet, and trust your judgment. Don't worry too much about what you believe to be correct here. I know there are some guides that say you should never do this and you should always do this, but the result is what's important, how the mix sounds. It can be hard to decide when a mix is completed, but sometimes you just gotta go for it, bounce the track. Normally, I find a good rule of thumb is that if for every step forward you feel like you're taking a step back with the changes that you make, it's probably time to finish with the mix. Getting a mix finally completed is really rewarding, and by setting up and preparing correctly and then following a logical process, you can get results much quicker and easier. So these are the 6 steps that I follow when I mix. I hope it's given you an idea of where you can start, and I hope next time you open a mix it won't be quite so overwhelming. Now obviously we didn't go into the technique of how to mix, but I've got loads of videos on the channel that teach you the ins and outs of the actual technicalities of mixing. I'll leave a link on the screen now actually where you can actually watch me go through a mix from start to finish and listen to everything I do, see what plugins I use and things. And also I've got more videos coming out every single week that go into detail on how to mix. So don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out. And also, as I said, I'm going to share something with you that you can download for free. I've left a link in the description below. It goes through the mixing process as we've discussed today. It goes into more detail and it has some links and things to some materials that might help you to take action on each of these steps. And leave a comment below. Let me know what you most struggle with when it comes to mixing, and I can focus in on that for you in a future video. I really hope this helps you to get started on your mixes and start getting some results. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.